Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Turkish President Erdogan got what he has long coveted, a popular mandate to legitimize his towering presence in the country's politics and social life. His critics call him a modern sultan. Does Erdogan's victory only divide the country more? Cross-talking Turkey, I'm joined by my guest, Gunya Yildiz in London. He is a Turkey and Kurdish affairs analyst. Also in London, we have Bill Park. He is a research fellow at King's College London. And in Beirut, we cross to Martin Jay. He is a freelance broadcast journalist. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Gunya, if I go to you first in London, I read a headline here from Foreign Policy magazine, R.I.P. Turkey, 2017. How do you take that headline?
I would have, argued against it, actually. I mean, there are lots of continuity, as well as some ruptures. I mean, for example, the current political environment, we can go back to 1980s when the Turkish establishment decided that Turkey needs to lean Islamism and combine it with Turkish nationalism in order to counter what was then the communist threat and the Kurdish nationalist threat. And President Erdogan and other Islamist movements and Turkish nationalism is a kind of a continuation of that. And the presidential system, it actually makes de jure the de facto situation. So President Erdogan was controlling the government, making foreign policy, and for the last few years. And this situation will make situation de jure.
If I can stay with you, then he's just really legitimizing what actually exists in Turkish politics, yes? Because many would claim that he was working outside of the Constitution over the last few years. So he's just legitimized it, yes?
Yes, he just legitimized it, but the margin of the victory isn't that high, that wide. That tells, if the margin of the victory was wider, that would have told President Erdogan that he can calm the domestic political tension and also mend relations with the Western countries, particularly European Union. But since the margin of victory is too narrow, it might lead him to think that he needs political crises in order to have his legitimacy, because he is a better manager of crises than his rivals.
Okay, Martin, if I can go to you, I mean, there was a great deal of criticism of the campaign, of the referendum, and the yes vote media was given free rein. The people that were against it were shunned and not given as much media space. And then it was such a close vote. I mean, this is more problematic than it sounds. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was a very close vote indeed, and I think it's that close. I mean, a cigarette paper between one or the other. I think that result is going to worry Mr. Erdogan very much. I think he's made a mistake. I really think he shot himself in the foot. I don't think he needed to do this, and now I think we have a whole new dynamic now in Turkey unfolding. The Gulf states in the Middle East, we're looking at him towards what sort of a country is Turkey becoming now? Is it going to become less secular and more like many of these countries in the Middle East, which don't really have an opposition party or any real effective press or independent judiciary? So I think there's a lot there at stake, and I didn't think he needed to do it. I think he's got tough times ahead, and I think now the issue now in Turkey for 2019 is whether he can remain in office and continue with this new return to the past. I mean, we're going back to the Ottoman Empire days of where the judiciary and the parliament and key institutions are now governed by one individual. So I think there's a lot for him to worry about.
Wait, Bill, the outcome was such a razor-thin outcome that actually, in a way, could really galvanize the opposition, because there were complaints at the very end of the polling process that the way some of the ballots were marked, that they were beyond the confines of the electoral code. I mean, there were a lot of complaints about that. Does this galvanize the opposition right now? And I want to talk about different elements of the opposition later. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, that is one of the problems. The opposition is very divided. You're right that the vote was very close. It might also have been fiddled enough for that margin to have been, in effect, cheating. Maybe the vote should have been no. But Turkey has been polarised in this way in all of the recent elections. It, roughly speaking, 50-50 for and against Erdogan. So I think there are two issues. I mean, one is, to what extent can the opposition unite to oppose Erdogan? And secondly, what can they do even if they do unite? The fact is, he has 50% of the vote in a very high turnout, and he's had that kind of vote repeatedly, which is really pretty good for any elected politician. I mean, you don't get that in many West European countries. So he is genuinely popular. So I think the opposition certainly are bound to be angry and even depressed, but what they do about it, I think, is a much more problematic question.
You know, Gunye, it's very interesting. Erdogan was very quick to starve off any kind of criticism from the Europeans and the Western world, because after all, you have Brexit about 50-50, you have Trump about 50-50, and now you have this. So, I mean, you could say that the kind of electoral, we see this polarization here. I mean, speak to the fact that the major cities, it's an urban-rural difference in Turkey. I've been to Turkey many times. Being in Ankara, being in Istanbul, you know, you see a secular society. You see a very pluralistic society, but you go about 25 miles, 50 miles out, it's a very different picture. Go ahead.
Yes. I would say I argue with Bill that it's a polarized country, but I would add to that it's a fragmented country. It's a multipolar country. Yes, it is polarized on being against Erdogan and for Erdogan, but it's a further fragmented country, and the largest fragment in this society is pro-Erdogan camp, and you have other fragments. So in this environment, if you ask a binary question like it's yes or no, President Erdogan can divide the opposition by referring to several things like Turkish nationalism, which will divide Kurdish and non-Kurdish opposition, or Islamism, which would also divide Alevis and Sunni Turks. And also he can tap into anti-Western feelings, which is widely shared across the political spectrum, including secularists, nationalists and others. So he has a lot of ways to divide up the community. But this is the first time Erdogan is losing the majority in Istanbul. This was a town where he was, as you've mentioned, he was a mayor in mid-1990s. And people I've spoken to within the AK Party circles seemed genuinely worried about the fact that they've lost their majority in almost 8 big cities in Turkey.
You know, Martin, critics will say this will give Erdogan more fuel to stamp out the remnants of the alleged coup that not long ago, you know, reintroducing the death penalty. You know, I can, you know, politicians know how to conquer and divide and conquer, but I mean, if having such a diffuse opposition right here doesn't necessarily bode well, okay? Because you know, you'll have the issue of the Kurds, we have Syria, and we have the ambitions of Erdogan in the Middle East, which can cut all many different ways here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, but don't forget, at the moment, as we currently speak, he's in a very good position in the Middle East because most of the important players here have a great deal of respect for him. He's even got cordial relations with Israel. So I think in terms of actually cracking the whip and doing anything radical, I don't think he can do that. I don't think he can do what he might have expected to do with a larger majority from the referendum. I think now what he has to do is actually change course and become a centrist politician. He must now reach out to the Kurds, take advantage of this, and try and breathe new life into the peace agreement which collapsed in July 2015. You know, he needs to actually build bridges with the Kurds because they could be a huge problem for him in Syria. That's still a big question mark there. So I think we'll see a new Erdogan who will appear to be more secular, who will appear to be more international, more of a statesman and more of a politician. Now, whether he actually goes ahead with any of these plans on the ground, it's another matter, but we're certainly going to see, I think in the next couple of weeks, you're going to see a different tone altogether towards the European Union.
Okay.
And you know, look at the call that Trump made to him today, and look at that photograph that's been buzzing around on social media. The the happy couple. Trump phoning Erdogan, congratulating him. That says a lot. That says a hell of a lot.
I was just going to say, Bill, before we go to the break here, he may pull a Trump in reverse gears here. Well, I want to talk about foreign policy in the second half. Is the door closed to the European Union now? I mean, is the Europeans don't seem to be very pleased with the referendum, the process. Go ahead, Bill.
Yes, when you mentioned the West earlier, I think there's something of a breakdown. On the one side, you have the US, and I have to say the UK, which looks more likely to welcome Erdogan's victory, but the European Union more generally seems not so welcoming. Erdogan, in the wake of this referendum, has always referred to the Crusaders' attempt to bring Turkey down. So it doesn't look to me at the moment like he's going to try to build bridges. He certainly has a track record of flip-flopping. We've had a Kurdish peace process and they're very much the opposite, for example. So he can do an about turn, but I don't see any signs that he's going to do that. And given what he's been doing, even without the benefits of this referendum, imprisoning people without trial, sacking people without the right of appeal or even indeed any allegation being made against them, I don't really see that this narrow margin, this victory, which actually gives him more power, is going to mean that he's going to use less of that power. That wasn't the reason why he wanted these constitutional amendments. It wasn't the reason why he called the referendum. And so far, the signs are that he's going to use the power that he's got as much as he can to entrench his position and to fight off his opponents. So I don't really see a softening. But it's right to point out that in the past, he has flipped and flopped, gone backwards and forwards on different issues.
I think all of us could agree.
You have to say it's possible, but I don't think it's likely.
I think all of us have to agree. He's an amazing survivalist. Gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Turkish politics. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing Turkey's changing political landscape. Okay, Martin, let me go back to you in Beirut in a broader scope here. What is the future, if we can use Erdogan and the Turkish example, because Turkey has been used an example as a democracy in a Muslim country. I mean, what is the future based on this referendum, his political ambitions? Because critics will say is that when you start opening it up to a much harder line Islamists, people that want a more Islamic public life, it's kind of hard to control it. It tends to go in one direction when it is released. What is your sense of that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's like a ratchet. It only turns in one direction. It's very difficult to go back on any of the hardline measures that you carry out. Let's hope that Turkey doesn't go down the road of Saudi Arabia or Qatar and starts to create a singular society with only one mindset and one leader and one way of doing things, because that would be a great tragedy. But I think you have to look back. I think you have to. You mentioned a headline earlier about RAP Turkey. I don't see it like that. I'm more optimistic, but I would have seen that headline as RIP European Union.
Yes.
Because what we've learned from all this is that the failure of Turkey, the failure of Turkey to carry on with this illusion, if you like, that it can be a modern Western secular country with a free press and a thriving opposition party. I think this is the cat is out of the bag now, and I think that this is the failure of the European Union for 17 years to tease Turkey that it could play that role and benefit from it. But I also think it's a failure of the actual model itself. Western democracy, as we know it, isn't really working anymore, and it's not even really working very well in old Europe, in France or Britain. So, you know, for those countries on the periphery of the European Union, which look towards Brussels for assistance, for aid, for a new future, and wanted rewards in return, Turkey got a very bad deal. And Turkey's message now to the rest of the entire Mediterranean basin is that, you know, you can't take Brussels very seriously because, you know, look what happened with us. We didn't get anything in the end. But to go back to what it could be, I think there is a real possibility now that I'm not so sceptical as you are, Peter. I think there could be some golden nuggets to be gleaned from this, and one of them is I think Turkey could get quite an interesting deal with Brussels now. We could see new calls again to go back to this offer of visa-free travel for Turks in Europe, and that's really all they need. That's what they want. They're not interested in European Union membership. It's the one thing that the opposition and the incumbent government agrees on, which the European Union membership isn't really worth the paper it's written on. I mean, some Turks I talk to on a weekly basis tell me they're not even sure if the European Union, as we know it, will be around in 5 or 10 years' time.
Exactly.
But a visa-free travel deal, a visa-free travel deal is something that I think you'll see in Turkish newspapers talked about again.
Gunya,
go ahead, jump in. That's the point of the program. Please do. Please do.
Yes, I'm more pessimistic than Martin on Turkey, the prospects of Turkey EU relations. If you speak to the senior political advisors of President Erdogan, what you hear is that the European Union doesn't play a significant role in Turkey's strategic calculations. There are three main capital cities that play a role in Turkey's calculations, which are Washington, London, and Moscow. And Turkey is will try to benefit from differences of policies between Russia and US, and also keeping closer to UK. But when it comes to European Union, I mean, one of the first messages President Erdogan gave after referendum is that the Organization for Security and Cooperation should know their place when they talk about possible fraud in the election, and they can call for a referendum on Turkey's EU membership deal. This was something that he had also said in the campaign trail, and it's important that he repeated this. This is despite the fact that Germany and European Union is being the largest trade partner with Turkey. Right. But when it comes to influence, there's very little influence from European Union, and there's a Cold War going on between these two countries.
Well, Bill, I think the outcome of this, that's the only... Go ahead, jump in. That's the whole point of the program. Go ahead, Bill in London.
I was going to say, if I could add to that, he's also said he wants to bring back the death penalty.
Yep.
If you bring back the death penalty, that means Turkey is in effect out of the Council of Europe. And that means that anybody who appeals to the European Court of Human Rights will no longer have that appeal. So I just don't see on what basis Turkey is going to move closer to the European Union, either from the Turkish side of the equation or from the European side of the equation. Nothing that Turkey is doing looks good from the point of view of the European Union. It's also worth commenting on the visa-free travel. It's true that the Turkish government makes a big fuss about that. It's also true that the Turkish government is preventing quite a lot of Turks who are totally free to visit Europe from visiting. So there's lots of academics who are not allowed to visit Europe. They've had their passports, their right to travel from Turkey removed. So I don't know how really exercised this Turkish government is, even about visa-free travel. So I just don't really see the basis on which we can argue that the relationship is about to get closer. Okay. There doesn't seem to be anything going right in that relationship.
Yeah, well, Martin, it seems to me patently obvious. I mean, Erdogan just turned his back on the European Union. Sure, they can have trade, maybe on some issues of security. They can. I mean, it was a bad package deal. I should walk away from it. They wasted too much time and resources and humiliated in the process here. I mean, Turkey has its assets here. Let's go to foreign policy a little bit. Does Turkey's foreign policy change after this here, the consolidation of power here? Though Gunyan has already pointed out, it's really kind of consolidated what is already happening on the ground right now. Let's talk about Syria. Let's talk about the Kurds. Martin, go ahead.
Well, I think that's up in the air now, and that's really the problem. I mean, so much now depends on the next few days and few weeks with the relationship which we'll see emerge with Trump in Washington, whether the Americans will now give Erdogan what he wants, which is, of course, the extradition deal on the cleric Yulan. But it's so difficult to predict how things can turn out now in Syria. There is a groundswell of of positive feeling here amongst many Gulf Arab states in the region, that now is the opportunity, believe it or not, to go back to this old idea looking at the old idea of hitting Assad in Syria. And this is it's been coming up again and again, and we've seen in Washington that actually Trump's attitude towards the Middle East and Syria in particular is more or less mirrored by Obama's legacy. There's really not much difference in it at all. And if you look now, many of the positive rhetoric that's coming from Saudi Arabia and Qatar and even Israel, you get the feeling that we're looking at a new campaign. And this is what I think
yeah, but
that
Martin,
maybe Erdogan might be looking
all of the
at.
countries you just mentioned, I can understand here, but there's one caveat here. Turkey and the Kurds. Now, how does that play? So, okay, regime change is in play again. Okay, fine. How do the Kurds play into that? Because that is Erdogan's Achilles heel. Go ahead.
It's his Achilles heel, but it's also
Go ahead, finish up, Martin, then we'll go to Bill. Go ahead, Martin.
I think briefly it's his Achilles heel, but I think it's also it also could be a feather in his cap. He could play it if he manages to consolidate with the Kurds in Turkey. Perhaps he can renegotiate some sort of deal in the north there with the YPG groups that hold so much of that territory up there. And don't forget, these Kurdish groups in Syria can go anyway.
Yep.
We just don't know what the future is. They could even side again with Assad. So,
sure.
I mean, there's a lot to play for.
Bill, you wanted to jump in there. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I was going to say, right now, the ongoing issue is that the Americans have basically aligned themselves with the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are basically Kurdish-led, in the forthcoming attempt to liberate Raqqa. And Turkey really doesn't like that. And at the moment, there's no signs that the US are prepared to shift that position. In fact, it's a Pentagon position more than it's a Washington position. And I think Trump is inclined to leave things to the Pentagon in any case. So there is a very big issue between Turkey and the US, which is US support for the Kurds, which Turkey really doesn't like. As regards Assad, that's not in the hands of the US or of Turkey. That's much more in the hands of Moscow and Tehran.
Yep.
And they don't yet look at all likely to dump Assad. If they ever get likely to dump Assad, I don't think it'll be Turkey that persuades Russians of that. It'll be Washington, that they will arrive at a deal. So I think Turkey's basically been sidelined to a large extent, although not entirely, through its own fault. But it's been sidelined on this issue. The US has aligned itself with the Kurds, Russia has aligned itself with Assad, and Turkey doesn't like either of them.
And Russia can talk to the Turks, it can talk to the Damascus government, and it can talk to the Kurds. Yeah. Interesting arrangement there. Gunya, you've been very patient in London. Jump in, go ahead.
One line of argument, Peter, which I think that's no longer valid, is to think Kurds as a subcategory of Kurdish politics, as a subcategory of Syrian politics, Turkish politics, Iraqi politics, or Iranian politics. I think Kurds have become like an actor in themselves, and different parts of the Kurdish areas in these different countries are increasingly interlinked. So, and Turkish government is very well aware of this. So the Turkish government's policy towards Syrian Kurds is very much determined by the problems with its own Kurds. And Erdogan's politics is a strange mixture of being ideological but also being pragmatic. And your viewers might remember, shooting down of the Russian fighter jet and Erdogan supporting that decision, and then a few months later going back and changing his position. So he shows that he's very pragmatic. But it depends on how he interprets the results of this referendum. As you mentioned earlier, there is a strong support, the support for the no campaign from the Kurdish areas. If President Erdogan interprets this as that the political repression on the Kurdish movement hasn't worked and hasn't produced enough of a result, then he might seek to engage with that political movement. But if he thinks we've increased our votes, so the repression on the Kurdish movement works, then he might continue down that road. But one thing, that, as mentioned earlier, clear is that Turkey's Syria policy has failed, but the biggest failure came with the Syrian Kurds.
I have to jump in here, gentlemen. We're running out of time, but one thing is for sure, the Turkish president is a survivalist. Many thanks to my guests in London and in Beirut, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, Crosstalk rules. Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Turkish President Erdogan got what he has long coveted, a popular mandate to legitimize his towering presence in the country's politics and social life. His critics call him a modern sultan. Does Erdogan's victory only divide the country more? Crosstalking Turkey, I'm joined by my guest, Gunya Yildiz in London. He is
I would have, argued against it, actually. I mean, there are lots of continuity as well as some ruptures. I mean, for example, the current political environment, we can go back to 1980s when the Turkish establishment decided that Turkey needs to lean Islamism and combine it with Turkish nationalism in order to counter what was then the communist threats and the Kurdish nationalist threat. And President Erdogan and other Islamist movements and Turkish nationalism is a kind of a...
Turkey and Kurdish affairs analyst. Also in London, we have Bill Park. He is a research fellow at King's College London. And in Beirut, we cross to Martin Jay. He is a freelance broadcast journalist. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Gunya, if I go to you first in London, I read a headline here from Foreign Policy magazine, R.I.P. Turkey, 1921, 2017. How do you take that headline? Yes?
Yes, he just legitimized it, but the margin of the victory isn't that high, that wide. That tells, if the margin of the victory was wider, that would have told President Erdogan that he can calm the domestic political tension and also mend relations with the Western countries, particularly European Union. But since the margin of victory is too narrow, it might lead him to think that he needs political crises in order to continuation of that. And the presidential system, it actually makes de jure the de facto situation. So President Erdogan was controlling the government, making foreign policy, and for the last few years. And this situation will make that situation de jure.
If I can stay with you, then he's just really legitimizing what actually exists in Turkish politics, yes? Because many would claim that he was working outside of the Constitution over the last few years. So he's just legitimized it.